This video is brought to you by Mubi, a curated streaming service showing exceptional films from around the globe. Get a whole month free at mubi.com/qualityculture.
We'll call you Pinocchio. Yes.
In the late 90s, a worn copy of Pinocchio lived among my collection of VHS tapes, the ones I threw on when there was nothing good airing on TV. It endured a monthly rotation, and I watched the puppet's adventures with wonder, confusion, and perhaps most significantly, fear. I've been showing various clips from the abundance of Pinocchio adaptations out there. The one I grew up with was the lesser-known 1996 live-action version called The Adventures of Pinocchio. Like the title itself, I think it's relatively faithful to the tone of the book. And probably because of that, though I watched it again and again, I was scared. I only looked at the marionettes, sometimes even Pinocchio himself, through the spaces between my fingers as I covered my eyes, especially the part where he first comes to life. The scene where he and his friends turn into donkeys is, appropriately, a hellish nightmare. And the sequences involving the monstrous whale instilled my lifelong dread of the deep sea. Thus, this film captured the true terror of the original Pinocchio for me. That was my version. There are a zillion iterations, yours is probably different. And of course, I'm not alone in feeling Pinocchio is an intrinsically scary story. This seems to be the general consensus even with the sugar-coated Disney version. I didn't watch that one until my adult years, but someone who did watch it in childhood was Guillermo del Toro, who still describes it as one of the scariest films he's ever seen.
I felt somebody understood how dark it felt to be a child. And I was like, yeah, this is not a happy cartoon on TV, this somebody gets it.
I get the sense a lot of us feel this way because Pinocchio, at its core, like many old-school fairy tales for children, is meant to be a terrifying cautionary tale. It depicts a mad world where bewildering and horrific things happen, and how they might happen to you if you don't behave like a good kid should. Of course, fairy tales weren't always for kids. As Del Toro describes, they were folk tales told around the fire to adults that reflected the famine, pestilence, and war of the real world, and were narrativized as spiritual journeys. And quote, Pinocchio is one of the great journeys of the spirit tales you will ever encounter. This speaks to why this story in particular has lasted as a fixture in the cultural zeitgeist. And even though it's been rehashed over and over and over again, Guillermo del Toro has managed to breathe new life into the tale, tapping into its subtext in a way that lets us ask new questions and consider different ideas. In my opinion, that's at least a top 3 reason why storytelling exists and should exist. So in this video, I'm going to explore how this story has evolved over the 140 years since its publication, and how Del Toro managed to bring out the themes from the original and showcase them in a new light. Quick reminder that if you enjoy our videos, consider supporting the channel for just $2 on Patreon. The original 1883 Pinocchio is thought to be misunderstood by audiences outside of Italy. The copy I read for this video even starts its intro by proclaiming that this is a book with a mission to rescue Pinocchio. It's full of annotations giving context, author's intent, and details that might have got lost in translation. The point is, if you haven't actually read it, it's tough to piece together an accurate perception of Pinocchio from the major tidbits we see here and there. For example, the fact his nose grows when he lies isn't a significant or even consistent aspect of the story. Sometimes it doesn't happen, or it'll grow for a totally different reason. In any case, I'll try to do my best to discuss the original faithfully. The Adventures of Pinocchio was written by Carlo Lorenzini, pen name Carlo Collodi, starting in 1881 as Story of a Puppet, a serial in one of the first Italian magazines for kids. This explains why it may feel episodic even in its adaptations, like a collection of incidents lumped together. It was published in full as a book in 1883, following the story of a sentient marionette and his disastrous life choices. So there's 3 main things to keep in mind to ground Pinocchio in historical context. First, Italy had unified only relatively recently. Collodi was a veteran of the First and Second Italian Wars of Independence, and after the country finally unified, he wanted to help advocate a sense of unity amongst its people. Secondly, partly due to this new status, economic hardship plagued the country. It was pretty rough for a lot of people, and industrialization was just barely ramping up. These two combined factors are why, in Italy in the age of Pinocchio, the book's described as an index of public anxiety if ever there was one. Lastly, they were starting to care more about children's education, and mandatory schooling was cropping up. Literature for kids was a relatively new thing, and this was no coincidence. The narratives in these books served a specific purpose. Besides reading and math, what did these kids need to know to prepare them for life in 19th century Italy? Well, in Nicolas Perella's An Essay on Pinocchio, he noted that the purpose of children's literature was to instill a sense of social responsibility in the poor and middle class alike, by appealing to the values inherent in moral principles, religion, and civic concern, and to create a unifying social and national consciousness in the young. Collodi's writings were no exception. He started his foray into children's lit with instructional school books that were heavy on the moralism. Pinocchio seems to be an extension of those, this time about a naughty kid learning to be obedient. And there's no denying, Pinocchio is in fact an insufferable brat. The intro in my copy describes him as lazy, mischievous, irresponsible, profoundly egotistical, and easily led astray, a late 19th century prototype for the likes of Bart Simpson. Even as he's being carved, he's already mocking Geppetto. He kicks him, steals his wig, and runs off as soon as he learns to walk. Most of the book involves him repeatedly disregarding the advice of his father figure Geppetto or mother figure the Blue Fairy. He even kills the talking cricket who he felt was being annoyingly preachy. Yeah, the cricket character was alive for 2 pages and only reappeared a couple times as a ghost. Of course, after ignoring everyone's guidance, he gets into all sorts of trouble. He's swindled out of his money, chased and hanged by bandits, goes to jail for 4 months, is forced to be a guard dog, is almost pan-fried, he's turned into a donkey and gets swallowed by a shark. And every time some crazy shit happens, he says something along the lines of, "I'm an idiot, if only I'd been a good boy and listened to so-and-so, I wouldn't be in this mess." The part where he was hanged at the end of chapter 15, the story was just supposed to end like that. I just find that so brutal even by that time's standards. Like, you shouldn't have been disobedient, see you in hell, idiot. But Collodi was urged to continue the story, so the shenanigans continued. Worst of all, Pinocchio is uninterested in studying or working. Quote, "Of all the trades in the world, the only one I really go for is eating, drinking, sleeping, having fun, and living from morning to night like a drifter." The book's heavy on the obedience thing because Pinocchio has to earn the right to be a real boy, not just by being good-natured, but through fulfilling societal obligations. Along with passages about how important it is to obey your elders, there are plenty about how essential it is to study. Like, bear this in mind, you silly little clunk. Kids who quit studying and turn their backs on books, schools, and teachers to give themselves up entirely to games and fun can't help but come to a miserable end. There's also plenty stressing the importance of work, to the point it seems studying is simply a means to that end. It's hard to grasp with our modern understanding, but back then, childhood wasn't as rigid of a concept, especially in the lower classes where everyone in the family had to contribute. As soon as kids had a degree of social independence, they were basically considered adults in training, a fresh addition to the working community that had to learn responsibility and duty to others. As Paul Hazard put it in the 1930s, children have never been anything but future men. It makes sense considering the desperate circumstances. Although Collodi supported education, he was hyper-aware of many people's dismal conditions, including the fact children can't prioritize school if their basic needs aren't being met. In Pinocchio, poverty is a wretched reality acknowledged again and again. There's no escaping it. The fire in Geppetto's fireplace is painted on the wall because he can't afford fuel. He sells his only coat during freezing winter to buy Pinocchio a schoolbook. Pinocchio's always lamenting how painfully hungry he is, and often abandons his picky eating habits because that pain is so persuasive. And in the end, after he's proven his work ethic to the Blue Fairy, even though he's transformed into a real flesh and blood boy, which I'll talk about later, there's no pretense of a rags to riches fantasy. Though the fairy bestowed other modest gifts, he's technically still poor and has to work tirelessly if he wants to survive, has to prove he's dependable to the people he cares about. A long, carefree childhood was a privilege afforded to few. The rest had theirs cut short, through joining the workforce or death. Learning responsibility is the crux of his spiritual metamorphosis. Pinocchio is the anti-Peter Pan. He had to grow up. There was no other choice. I'll be discussing the original Pinocchio more here and there, but I hope that covers the gist of it.
Who doesn't know the story of the marionette who became a boy?
Since it was published, The Adventures of Pinocchio exploded in popularity across the globe. It's the third most translated book ever, probably one of the best-selling too, though those numbers are harder to track down. And there have been hundreds of editions published, usually at least 1 or 2 a year. Italian critics regard it as a masterpiece in the literary canon. It's been interpreted and reinterpreted thousands of times, turned over and examined at every angle like a sacred text. A vast catalog of study referred to by one scholar as Pinocchiology. For all these reasons and more, it's understandably a national treasure. An Italian literary critic famously said in 1923 that Pinocchio is the testing ground for foreigners. Whoever understands the beauty of Pinocchio understands Italy. So on that note, along with the countless written interpretations, there are of course the media adaptations. There's no way I can cover all 60-ish of them, nor would I want to.
Father, when can I leave to be on my own?
But I do want to quickly touch on a few I find interesting. The very first was a silent film in 1911, one of Italy's first features. There's not a lot I can say about it honestly, I just think it's a cool bit of film history. It was actually thought to be a lost film until it was rediscovered in the 90s. A film that is lost though is Nobuto Ofuji's 1932 Pinocchio, a Japanese adaptation and the first attempt to animate Pinocchio. Would have been a landmark in animation history in general, but apparently got confiscated because they didn't have the rights. There aren't even any photos, so we're just left to imagine what it might have looked like. Though this 1936 Italian film, which was also lost, has a few surviving frames. It was set to become Italy's first animated feature, but because of production and budget issues, they had to abandon the project. And of course, there's Disney's animated classic in 1940, the version most Americans are familiar with. It was Disney's second ever feature film, with gorgeous, groundbreaking animation techniques. Though as scary as it was for some, it's still very much a sanitized rendition of Collodi's tale, a complaint I came across repeatedly from Italians.
Right and wrong? But how will I know?
The most egregious change was the main character himself. Disney's Pinocchio is an innocent, curious kid, not much like Collodi's in terms of personality or even appearance. Walt wanted the protagonist of his movie to be more likable, and as for the design, he wanted something less wooden and stilted and more like a normal child.
This is a matter of not just changing the character's design, but changing the character's behavior so that his status as a puppet was minimized.
Understandably, completely altering the nature of the character didn't sit well with Italian critics. Furthermore, the setting is thought to have been de-Italianized. Looks more like a generic European village with few references to the culture compared to the proudly Italian source material. Though to be fair, it was 1940 and Americans weren't exactly eager to celebrate fascist Italy. Anyway, I think along with Pinocchio himself, the distortion of the original is best exemplified by its famous song When You Wish Upon a Star, which is the Disney anthem to this day. Even though I think the film is a stunning work of art, it cemented its narrative legacy around essentially a platitude.
When you wish upon a star.
The hollow messaging of the movie seems to be a big part of what annoys Italians about it the most. Moving on, Italy finally got their animated feature in 1972, with production advised by Collodi's grandchildren. It's pretty faithful to the novel and incorporated Italian art influences. Like the backgrounds were inspired by Italian paintings, and Pinocchio's character design was based on his first color illustration. I think it's a pretty charming movie since I have a soft spot for vintage cartoons. The 1996 live-action version I used to watch was co-developed by Jim Henson, which makes a lot of sense considering the subject. Disney actually turned down the idea for this project. It's far from perfect, but the sincerity of it still gets to me.
I'm sorry for not being a real boy.
But you real to me, my son. Real to me.
In 2002, Roberto Benigni released a version which he wrote, directed, and starred in as Pinocchio, but the 2019 film he starred in as Geppetto was a bigger critical success. It's described as a gothic fantasy as it leans into the grim reality of the original Pinocchio. Here's a picture of the director with a storyboard he drew for Pinocchio when he was 6. I just love that. Anyway, it's definitely the best live-action version out of all of them. And yes, that includes 2022's Disney release, which, I mean, there's not much more I can say about these live-action copies they keep churning out. Most of them are disappointing and unnecessary, and this one certainly falls into that category. Like I said, I left out plenty in this little rundown, as there's dozens of adaptations from all over the world, including TV shows and theater productions, not to mention pop culture references. Pinocchio is a long-established staple in popular culture, and I honestly thought I had my fill, until Del Toro announced he was working on his own version.
Hello?
Guillermo del Toro's Pinocchio was co-directed by notable stop-motion animator and director Mark Gustafsson, and co-written by Patrick McHale, creator of Over the Garden Wall. As you've probably heard, this movie was in production hell for like 10 years since it kept getting rejected for funding. Finally got picked up by Netflix in 2018, and I'm so glad it did. There's so much to delve into, though first I want to bring up the incredible medium Del Toro insisted on using for the project.
Stop motion is incredibly time-consuming, and it's an art form that is therefore perpetually in the verge of extinction, sustained only by mad people that have no other function in society but to do stop motion, which includes me, fortunately, and I love it because of that.
Animation was his first love in filmmaking. His first movie was supposed to be a claymation feature until a burglar destroyed all his work and then literally peed and pooped on the floor for some reason. It seems he's been slowly making his way back to animation ever since, and strongly believes it's a medium meant for everyone, not just children.
Animation is not a genre, it's a medium. When it was born alongside any adult narrative of cinema.
I love stop motion in particular because if every motion in animation is calculated and deliberate, that's 10 times as true for stop motion. It's a meticulous art form and an extraordinary labor of love. Every small gesture, every frame, every beautiful imperfection is a constant reminder of the immense effort put into making it. And Del Toro says he was particularly inspired by Hayao Miyazaki's quiet moments and unnecessary movements. Small things like Carlo making sure the doors shut behind him, Geppetto fumbling around with a balloon. These details add hours or even days to production time, but they help create a sense that these characters are real, thinking people. Speaking of, in this version, everyone is a puppet, not just Pinocchio. This is partly why Del Toro insisted on stop motion. Pinocchio's character feels as though he actually belongs in this world. I better understood what he meant when I watched the new Disney adaptation. The CGI Pinocchio seems awkwardly out of place beside his live-action counterparts. It just feels off, like nothing has weight to it. For Del Toro's design, he sought out the help of Chris Grimley, who illustrated a 2002 edition of the book.
We made him asymmetrical because Geppetto carves him when he's drunk.
With that, we can get into the narrative, as this scene is one of the first most striking differences in the film. Geppetto doesn't assemble him competently and carefully, but during an episode of grief-induced drunken rage, determined to remake his dead son. His anguish is palpable and moving. When I describe this film as a dark take on a dark tale, I'm not likening it to pointless macabre fan theories about stories that are genuinely innocent. I don't think darker or grittier interpretations are inherently better or more interesting. Instead, I feel what Del Toro did was take a story that was already pretty grim and expanded on its subtle elements. To start, he borrowed Disney's idea of making the cricket a focal character and narrator, one of Disney's better changes. Sebastian the Cricket begins his narration with Geppetto's tragic backstory, which this film has in common with the Disney live-action remake, but here it was actually used for an emotional and even political framework instead of just kind of thrown in. Geppetto loses his son Carlo during World War I, an event highlighting the senseless cruelty of war.
These planes were heading back to base and simply let go of their bombs to make their ballast lighter.
But I'll get more into that later. Years later, when he furiously carves Pinocchio, the puppet's brought to life by a wood sprite who pities Geppetto.
Fill his days with light, so he'll never be alone.
This version of Pinocchio includes what I believe is a vital aspect to the story, and that's that Pinocchio is an annoying little shit. At least at first. He breaks things, talks back, and never does what he's told.
I won't be locked up. I'll smash the windows out, I will.
The cricket tries to rein him in as per usual, but Pinocchio's having none of it.
My dear father.
I'm going to church.
As Del Toro describes, he starts out like a frenzied 6-year-old, unwieldy and endlessly curious about how the world works. And Geppetto wants nothing to do with him. Pinocchio's not like Carlo. He's careless and persistently disobedient. This isn't the kind of child he signed up for.
Made you to be like Carlo. Why can't you be more like Carlo?
I identify with Pinocchio very much. As
You do?
Yeah, I did, as I did with Frankenstein's creature. because I feel that they are both about a father just giving birth to a son, sort of in a haphazard manner, and sending the kid into what is an experiential, almost initiatic journey through life to figure it out without any real assistance. And I felt like that as a kid. I felt like the truths and lies that the adults were praying that I understood were all really hollow. And life was telling me a bunch of things that were different.
Pinocchio's all over the place, but he's not evil. He's what Perella calls a good bad boy as opposed to a bad bad boy. He's troublesome and irritating at times, but his heart seems to be in the right place.
Oh, that's...
Yet no one else seems to want him either.
It's a demon! Witchcraft!
His sudden appearance in their little Tuscan town wasn't welcomed with friendliness, unless of course they had something to gain from him.
The star of my puppet show!
He either performs or you owe me
10 million lira!
After Geppetto hands Pinocchio a harsh rejection,
You are such a burden.
Pinocchio runs away with the circus to help pay off Geppetto's new debt to Volpe. Meanwhile, Geppetto follows his trail, searching for him across the country. Although a few of the plot points follow familiar beats, like Pinocchio performing in a theater show as a stringless puppet, or later being swallowed by a sea monster, one of the more Del Toro-like additions is the wartime context.
War is not good. War took Carlo away from me.
In the vein of The Devil's Backbone and Pan's Labyrinth, which are set during and after the Spanish Civil War, Pinocchio is mostly set sometime between the world wars during Italy's fascist regime.
Devil's Backbone, Pinocchio, and Pan's Labyrinth form a little trilogy about childhood and war.
Pinocchio's musical performances morph into political propaganda, advocating for war and singing the praises of Benito Mussolini, Italy's then dictator and leader of the National Fascist Party. Del Toro makes a mockery out of Mussolini, not just with the caricature-like design, but through Pinocchio's rebellion.
Yes, poop, Your Excellency.
Baby poops his pants.
Pinocchio puts on a marvelously juvenile performance to taunt him, comparing him to literal excrement. It's exactly what a kid would do to make fun of someone, but also the most essential type of ridicule his memory deserves. As in, he's a piece of shit. This is the point at which the film stops being a musical. Afterwards, the sequence in Playland, Funland, Pleasure Island, whatever you want to call it, with the donkey transformation was replaced with the kidnapping to a training camp for fascist youth, which I guess is similar in its implications. Young boys thinking they're going to have fun, but are really being transformed into obedient and expendable resources. Duty to country held a very different connotation in Collodi's time. Like I mentioned, Italy hadn't been unified for long, and a sense of national identity was still being established among the people. Collodi was passionate about this cause and wrote a lot for political magazines, especially early on. This Pinocchio depicts the dangers of blind loyalty and compulsory nationalism. Based on my book's annotations, there seemed to be a persistent, collective sense of helplessness among the Italian people, a fatalistic resignation to the fate bestowed upon them by the powers that be. It even points to this as a factor for Pinocchio's success. Quote, "It has been argued that the very fact that Pinocchio is a puppet, that he is a creature without control of his destiny and susceptible to the manipulation of others, is part of the reason why Italians have taken him to their hearts." Del Toro turns this fact about Pinocchio on its head.
You must obey your papa.
Obey?
Do as you're told.
But I don't want to obey.
I wanted to do a movie about a world where everybody behaves like a puppet except the puppet.
As the book emphasizes the importance of obedience, for Del Toro, to be unquestioningly obedient is what opens you up to manipulation. As Perella writes about the original Pinocchio, the good bad boy is eventually redeemed and shaped into the exploitable boy adult that Geppetto had in mind when he conceived him. One thinks of those fairy tales that tell of the metamorphosis of an ugly frog into a handsome prince after the incantation has been broken. But it's not Pinocchio's social status that changes. The puppet's transformation is the result of his unalterable acceptance of a rigid work ethic within a social structure that goes unquestioned.
Who controls you?
I control him.
Who controls you?
Del Toro views fascism as a dangerous extension of this obedience, and parallels this sort of paternalistic loyalty to country to the paternal relationships within the film.
Let's make a story made of fathers and sons, including fascism, which is a paternalistic concern. and the enthronement of a father figure that doesn't exist.
He does this not only with an angry Geppetto and unruly Pinocchio, but with the village Podestà and his son Candlewick, and with Count Volpe and the monkey Spazzatura, who incredibly was voiced by Cate Blanchett.
She said, "You gotta give me a part on Pinocchio. Only the part left is a monkey."
In the case of the former, the Podestà is a fascist government official who wants his son to be an example of a brave, strong man, a military hero even. He takes a liking to Pinocchio because of his immortality.
This boy cannot be killed. He's the ideal soldier.
For him, being a real boy means making your country proud by battling in war.
You will learn to fight and fire a weapon and be a real Italian boy.
His characterization echoes the convention I shared before, treating children as simply future men. Meanwhile, Candlewick fails in living up to his father's expectations.
My father says if you're afraid to die for your country, you're weak. You're a coward.
Then you have Count Volpe, a showbiz manager exploiting Pinocchio for profit. Volpe's a combination of the characters Mangiafuoco, the fox, and the ringmaster, and so he's on a mission to take full advantage of Pinocchio's existence. Spazzatura yearns for Volpe's approval, only to be subject to vicious beatings whenever he's insubordinate. At first, Spazzatura and Candlewick are both jealous of Pinocchio, who seemingly gained their father's acceptance, which had always been out of reach for them. But Pinocchio befriends them, and just as importantly, he shows what their father's supposed approval would actually grant them, a life constrained by manipulation and brutality. So they discover their autonomy. They rebel and become more like Pinocchio instead of the other way around.
I can say no to you. I can do that!
As far as making disobedience a positive thing, a virtue as Del Toro called it, I don't think it's completely at odds with Collodi's vision. In the novel, he regularly demonstrated how easy it is for kids to be manipulated by their peers and adults who don't have their best interests at heart. He also showed how not behaving consciously and responsibly could lead to a devastating state of affairs. But what Del Toro contends in his version is that even the adults you should be able to trust can be wrong. Perhaps they birthed you, perhaps they fed or taught or raised you, but this doesn't make them infallible.
I wanted stories of fathers and sons that reflected my story as a father and my story as a son. And I, as a son, I was unable to see my father as a person. It was a shadow in my life that I interpreted as something more than human, for good and bad. And I only reconciled his stature as a human as he neared his death.
Sometimes fathers feel despair, like everyone else.
So rather than following the thread of Pinocchio becoming a real boy, the story's instead about Geppetto learning to be a real father. Echoing his message in The Shape of Water, Del Toro disliked the notion of a physical transformation at the end, expressing the idea that love isn't about transformation, it's about understanding. Similar to the book, Pinocchio saves Geppetto from the belly of the sea monster and shows he's a capable, compassionate person who cares for those around him. But here, when he's brought back to life by the wood sprite, he's still the same wooden marionette, not a flesh and blood boy. And this isn't acknowledged by the characters because it doesn't matter. It never mattered.
I love you exactly as you are.
Then I will be Pinocchio.
That will do.
Even Carlo Collodi had doubts about how he wrote the ending, particularly the last sentence. In the book, after the whole shark thing, Pinocchio spends months studying and working to support Geppetto, and only then does the fairy transform him into a flesh and blood boy overnight. But the thing is, the now soulless marionette is still there in the room. Quote, Pinocchio turned to look at him, and after he had looked at him for a little while, he said to himself with deep satisfaction, how funny I was when I was a puppet, and how happy I am now to have become a good little kid. Sometimes good is translated as well-behaved or respectable, which are a bit harsher. Still, even the most faithful of adaptations seem to omit this detail from the ending. Collodi was reportedly a bit uneasy about having treated the puppet with such smug disdain. He even told a friend he didn't remember ending it that way, including the ominous ellipsis that has sparked numerous debates. There's speculation he may have tried to atone for the ending in a later project about a monkey, where, after being dressed up in human clothes, the character cries, "It's not me anymore. They dressed me up as a man, and I became a frightening monster." I mention all this because there's something sad about the thought of the discarded, lifeless marionette propped up on the chair and rejected by the new Pinocchio with such casual contempt. He's a new man now, has no time for silly kid stuff. Yet was Pinocchio so entirely unlovable in this form? Sure, he was gullible and defiant like kids often are, but he was still learning. He was well-meaning, usually. Did that mean nothing? Are children only real, only worth accepting if they can be controlled? Del Toro doesn't think so. There's a reason The Devil's Backbone, Pan's Labyrinth, and Pinocchio all feature children as antagonists to fascism. Their inquisitive nature and aversion to discipline provide a logical adversary for an authoritarian ideology.
Obviously, the puppet is quite a dissident, an independent thinker.
But you have to go now. It's the law.
Even when it's something bad?
In regards to the novel, while it remains true that education is a privilege and most of us have to work to survive, it seems part of it also seeks to remove challenges to the status quo, to install more children as cogs in the cycle of social conformity. I think this is best expressed in a passage near the end of Perella's essay. The child and the adult will occasionally feel a pull toward the freedom he thinks was his when he was really a child. Children, after all, look forward to adulthood as the promised land, whereas adults look back to childhood as the lost Eden. But it need be neither uncritical nostalgia, nor the bad conscience of an adult who has surrendered too completely, nor simply impish perversity that makes today's readers wonder who is more the puppet, the wayward and at times irreverent wooden marionette, or the handsome boy adult who takes hold of the golden cord, never to let go of it again and never to deviate from the role he must play in society. A reader's resistance or disappointment may derive not from a desire for total retreat from the adult world, but rather from a sense of something excessive and small-minded in the thorough rejection of the puppet by the new Pinocchio. No amount of historicizing will keep us from finding him for his age and even for his times too young to be abandoning the child. That is, spontaneity, exuberance, and fantasy so completely. Del Toro's Pinocchio isn't forced to abandon this most essential part of himself. Instead, Geppetto abandons his quest for perfection, a point alluded to in the beginning with Carlo's pinecone.
No, Carlo. It has to be perfect.
Geppetto learns to love his child as he is, rather than who he thinks he should be. This sentiment surely speaks to those who grew up feeling out of place or unwanted, as Del Toro did. There was actually a fourth father-son story at play, mostly in the background, Jesus and God.
If you go back to Collodi imbued a lot of esoteric and religious and philosophical things on Pinocchio. One of them was an analogy to Jesus, and I wanted to recuperate that.
Pinocchio being interpreted as a Christ-like figure is nothing new. It's a pretty frequent note in analyses. Geppetto's a carpenter whose name derives from Giuseppe, aka Joseph, and the blue fairy's color matches the Virgin Mary's cloak. I don't know if this was really Collodi's intent. There's some contention about this reading. Nevertheless, Del Toro expanded on it with a more direct comparison.
He's made of wood too. Why do they like him and not me?
Jesus' message was largely about tolerance and acceptance, a belief reiterated by this film. The parallels continue with Pinocchio's resurrections. Though unlike Jesus, he dies and is revived 4 times, something you definitely won't find in any of the other adaptations.
Oh, hi, it's me.
Though even the original Pinocchio seemed to have a preoccupation with death. There's of course the literal death at the end of chapter 15 that was retconned. Interestingly, just before Pinocchio was hanged, he met the girl with blue hair for the first time. The character later evolved into the Blue Fairy. In this original account, the fairy wasn't introduced as a sentimental bringer of life, but an unsettling omen of death. While fleeing from the bandits, Pinocchio bangs on the door to a seemingly empty house until a girl with blue hair appears. This is how it went. Without moving her lips at all, she said, in a tiny, feeble voice that seemed to come from the afterworld, "No one lives in this house. Everyone is dead." "At least you could open the door for me," shouted Pinocchio, weeping and pleading for her help. "I'm dead too." "Dead? Then what are you doing there at the window?" "I'm waiting for the coffin to come take me away." As soon as she had said these words, the little girl disappeared, and the window closed without a sound. Eerie stuff. As far as more death-like experiences, there's the stint in Funland where Pinocchio transforms into a donkey, a sort of hellish underworld experience. He's also tossed into the ocean and his donkey flesh gets eaten away by fish to reveal the wooden puppet within. And he's later swallowed by a colossal dogfish, imitating long-established storytelling of emerging from sea monsters to signify rebirth and regeneration. After this, Pinocchio finally changes his ways for good, and is granted his final metamorphosis. As remarked in Death and Rebirth in Pinocchio, Collodi uses archetypal birth-death-rebirth motif as a means of structuring his hero's growth to responsible boyhood. Beneath the book's comic fantasy texture, but not far beneath, lies a symbolic journey to the underworld, from which Pinocchio emerges whole. Del Toro pulled on this thematic thread much more for his narrative. When Pinocchio's hit by a truck and dies for the first time, he awakens in the actual underworld being transported in a coffin by black rabbits, imagery borrowed from the book. In the afterlife, the wood sprite's sister, Death, explains that Pinocchio can't actually die. He'll simply return to the underworld every time and wait until the hourglass empties, but each wait time will be longer than the last. The wood sprite and Death characters make sense as a fresh interpretation of the Blue Fairy, who in the book resurrected Pinocchio again and again.
Death and life on Pinocchio look like Mexican carvings from 100%. The seraphims and the archangels in colonial paintings, they have eyes on their wings. This is from Judeo-Christian mythology, where each of those eyes is going to close when a soul dies.
I think the resurrections in Del Toro's version serve two thematic purposes. First, as expressed in an IGN article, the circumstances of Pinocchio's deaths reveal the different facets of fear that define the men responsible for him, which in turn reflect the different ways that a country steeped in fascism and war kills their sons. But also, a major takeaway from this device is that life is only meaningful because it's finite.
The one thing that makes human life precious and meaningful, you see, is how brief it is.
After Pinocchio dies for the fourth and final time, the wood sprite appears to the once again grief-stricken Geppetto, explaining that she only wanted to bring him joy. And he says something I've thought about every day since.
You did bring me joy. That's terrible, terrible joy.
Terrible, terrible joy. I'd never heard a phrase that so perfectly yet concisely captured the duality of the experience of love. The intense beauty and appreciation paired with the knowledge of its impermanence. Terrible joy. As much as it was a symbol of Geppetto's need to let go of perfection, Carlo's pine cone also represented the cycle of life and death. The design on Death's tail even mirrors its scaly pattern. The pine cone provided the seed for the tree Pinocchio was carved from. And although their personalities differ, it's hinted that Pinocchio is a spiritual descendant of Carlo. He knows things Carlo knew.
That song. How could he know that song?
Death seems to recognize him even on their first meeting.
Who are you? I feel as though you've been here before.
And Death goes on to describe him as the wooden boy with the borrowed soul. When Sebastian uses his one wish to revive Pinocchio, his borrowed soul lives on with Geppetto, Sebastian, and Spazzatura for the rest of their days. Over the years, his companions pass away. There's a poignant juxtaposition of Geppetto in the beginning wasting away over Carlo's death, versus Pinocchio at the end, who accepts his found family's deaths with an air of understanding and gratitude for the time they had together.
For me, the final line in the movie, I wrote as a distillation of everything I've come to understand to be true about life, how important and unimportant we are.
What happens, happens, and then we are gone.
It's very simple, it's very accepting of the fact that we're here very briefly and we matter not much, but we matter in the chain of kindness that we can create for others.
So, in Del Toro's way, the film is dark but uncynical. It returns fairy tales to their primary purpose, as a reflection of a brutal yet love-filled world. So while we've had no shortage of adaptations, it's a worthy addition to the Pinocchio collection. Thanks for watching. Let me know what your go-to version of Pinocchio has always been and what you thought of this rendition. This has become my second favorite Del Toro film after Pan's Labyrinth. And if you want to find more quality films made with care and passion for the craft, Mubi is the perfect resource.
We need to shut the curtain. Mark it.
Mubi is a curated streaming service dedicated to elevating great cinema from all around the globe. From iconic directors to emerging auteurs, there's always something new to discover. With Mubi, each and every film is hand-selected. It's like your own personal film festival, streaming anytime, anywhere. The film I'm most excited about right now is Decision to Leave, directed by Park Chan-wook, one of the best directors out there. He directed Old Boy in 2003 and The Handmaiden in 2016. Now his latest 2022 film Decision to Leave is on Mubi. It's about a detective investigating a man's death, and he sort of develops a relationship with the dead man's wife. There's some mystery, some romance, a bit thrilling, so much to make for a really compelling story. The cinematography, of course, is also stunning to look at. Just a great film all around. I really recommend it. If you want to check it out, you can try Mubi free for 30 days at mubi.com/qualityculture. That's mubi.com/qualityculture for a whole month of great cinema for free. Again, thanks for being here. Can't tell you how thankful I am for all of you. I hope your New Year's celebration was lovely. I'll see you guys next time.